to this evening. Delighted to welcome back Professor Jason Houston, whose day job is he's the director of Gonzaga in Florence, one of the more important American university study programs. In 5 years on this occasion and several times before, is increasingly abituato to be Fiorentino, and is a world-class expert on Boccaccio, as well as knowing a hell of a lot about Dante. And he tells me that talking about Dante is one of his favorite things. And this is a bit of a break from the challenges of running an American Study Abroad program in Florence, whilst we're still dealing with masks and green passes and the rest of it. Just a note for those in the room, everybody here has got a green pass. Everybody has double vaccinations. So we'll ask you to keep your masks on during the talk. And at the end, we'll open the windows at the back and have a glass of wine, at which point you can take your mask off, but try and keep a bit of distance between you and other people for safety. Sorry, the Zoomers can't join us for that, but we're delighted to have you here remotely. And you, of course, can join in the chat at the end when Jason's finished his talk. So that's enough for me, and over to Jason Houston.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for the invitation to come back once again to speak with you in person, this time at the British Institute in Florence. I did a talk here, well, it's been 3 years ago because I did it in person, and I covered a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So if any of you were there 3 years ago, I apologize. There'll be one slide that's repetitive from that. Because in fact, what I've worked on in my dissertation in my first book, which was called Building a Monument to Dante, Boccaccio as Dantista, was this idea of how was Boccaccio in those early years. Boccaccio lived 1303 to 1370. Dante died in 1321, as we all know. How was Boccaccio formative in creating the image of Dante that comes today? Living here in Florence, I keep running across examples of Dante monumentalized, and I keep learning more and more about the backstory of these monuments. And so that's what I want to do today, is show you and walk you through in a kind of a light manner. I mean, I might be a little irreverent today. I'm sorry. Dante died officially yesterday, 700 years ago. So this can be his wake. We can enjoy a little bit. And I know that you guys just went through a 2-day-long reading of the entire Divine Comedy by a group of incredible actors. So I think taking a break from the serious work of commemorating Dante, which is happening this year, and maybe looking a little bit about some of the side effects of this monumentalization process. Excuse me, that's a hard word in any language to say, is what I intend to do today. So I say 600 years of Florence almost honoring Dante, because I do want to point out, and I'm going to go kind of chronologically, not comprehensively. I have no conceit about covering everything in terms of the monuments to Dante in Florence. That would take a longer amount of time than we have tonight. But I want to do a sweep across and look at a couple different monuments to Dante here in Florence that you've probably all seen and maybe walked by frequently, and talk a little bit about some of the context around those. But first, let's talk a little bit about this celebration. So Dante is born in 1265, as we all know, and dies in 1321. And as I've learned in looking into this stuff, these are the 2 years, and perhaps the only 2 years, that anybody in Florence cares at all about Dante. So every 65 and every 21, everything's about Dante. So the anniversary of his birth and the anniversary of his death, things are about Dante. The other 98 years, not so much. And so we're in the middle of that, and we should enjoy it. So just to show you the historical context of this, I have a picture up here from a movie by Pierpaolo Pasolini, famous Italian director. This is a still from Uccelacci Uccellini. I think it's called Hawks and Sparrows in English. And as you see here, Totò, the famous comedic actor who is the main actor in that film. It's Pasolini's only comedy, although sometimes you do laugh at other parts of Pasolini's other movies, but they're not meant to be comedies. And his favorite actor, Ninetto Davoli, who's there on the right, who's almost in every Pasolini movie, are basically so this whole movie is a kind of tour of the outskirts of this Rome that's becoming. And they pass this bus with the signs Convegno Dentisti Dantisti, the conference of dentists for Dante. Guess what year this movie was made? 1965. 21. So Pasolini's picking up on the fact that and it comes out in 66, but it's filmed in 65. So the 65s are this time when everybody's talking about Dante, even your dentist. I have a rule that whenever I talk about Dante, we got to read a little bit of Dante. So even in this setting where I said we're not going to do a lot of a serious discussion of Dante, perhaps, I do want to begin by locating us in a place that I think has suggested to the people who have wanted to make monuments to Dante throughout history, the relationship that Dante has to Florence. And so that's what I really want to get to here, is this kind of problematic relationship between Dante and the city of Florence. We all know that Dante is in exile. We all know that in 1301, Dante is exiled from Florence and he never comes back. And he dies in Ravenna in 1321. And ever since then, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, Florence wants Dante back, his bones. And I will tip my hat here as a good academic. I need to cite my sources. But I also brought this because it's a fantastic read, this new book by Guy Raffa, who's a professor at the University of Texas, wonderful scholar. But this is a very accessible book. It's an academic book, but it's something anybody can read, called Dante's Bones. And it's a story of the fights and the struggles that have been going on to get Dante's bones back to Florence ever since he died in Ravenna in 1321. So, but as everything about Dante, the story of Dante begins with Dante, meaning Dante wrote his own story. The Divine Comedy, in many ways, is a biography, and that's in many ways the innovative nature of the Divine Comedy. It is a story about us, it's allegorical, but it's a story about one particular man, Dante, and his love for one particular woman, Beatrice. And so every myth of Dante starts with Dante, because he creates his own story in the comedy. And so he tells us how he's going to be monumentalized in Florence when he talks about his own exile in Canto 17 of Paradise. So Canto 17 of Paradise is where Dante meets the great heroes of Christianity and the Old Testament, who are in the heaven of Mars, which is also the heaven of related to Mars, who is associated with Florence. So in Florence, Mars was worshipped before, St. John the Baptist became later. Dante talks about Florence in the heaven of Mars. So cantos 15, 16, and 17 are, 15 is Florence's past history, 16 is Florence's present history, and 17 is Florence's future in the terms of the poem. Remember Dante's great trick. Dante was exiled in 1300, 1301. He writes the Divine Comedy afterwards. He starts at about 1307, writes it until his death or near his death. But he sets it in 1300. So in the time, in the economy of the poem, things are happening in Easter of 1300. But Dante, the writer, is writing 10, 15 years after that. So all these prophecies that he's putting in this poem, which we're going to look at here, are actually him telling history he knows, but putting it in the prophetic mode, because in the economy of the poem, these are future events. So he's telling the past, present, and future of Florence, but he's actually telling all the past of Florence in this context of the poem. And of course, like any story of past, present, future, the past was great, the present's bad, and the future's worse from Dante's perspective. So let's look at what he learns. And in this Canto 17, he learns about the future of Florence. It's going to get much worse than it already is now. And it's going to get worse for you, particularly Dante, because in 1300, he's not yet exiled. So the character of Dante in the poem is not yet exiled, but the poet of the poem is 20 years after and knows about this exile. So he has this prophecy come out, which predicts something that he already knows is going to happen. So his relative, Cacciaguida, is telling him about his future. And here Dante asks Cacciaguida at the beginning of this citation, I've heard a lot of prophecies throughout my journey in hell, but I don't understand them because they've been hidden in this kind of crazy language. Can you tell me what my future holds? So he says, grave, this is Dante, the character speaking. Grave words were said to me about my future life. However much I feel prepared foursquare against the blows of chance. And I'm going to come back to that word foursquare. Tetragono is the Italian. Effects come slower. So he says, if you can tell me in clear words what's going to happen to me, I'll be prepared foursquare against what's going to happen. Because it doesn't sound good. And now the poet speaks. So this is the poet preamble, gives a preamble to Cacciaguida's words. Not with cloudy sayings by which the foolish folk, pagans, were ensnared before the Lamb of God who takes away our sins was slain, but in plain words and clear speech, that paternal love replied, this fellow named Cacciaguida, hidden and yet revealed in his own smile. And here's what Cacciaguida says, Dante's ancestor, to Dante about his upcoming exile. As Hippolytus was forced to flee from Athens because of his stepmother, treacherous and fierce, so shall you be forced to flee from Florence. This is the plan already set in motion that soon will bring success to him who plots it, where Christ is bought and sold all day. The great villain of the Divine Comedy is not Satan, it's Boniface VIII. And here he makes his last appearance. Well, actually, he'll be vilified again. The preacher in Rome who's a part of this plot to exile Dante. The populace shall blame the injured party, you, as it always does, but vengeance shall bear witness to the truth that meets it out. You shall leave behind all you most love dearly, all you dearly love, and that shall be the arrow first loosed from exile's bow. Notice how Cacciaguida picks up on Dante's metaphor of the arrow, of the violence that's about to happen to him. And this is a famous line, this famous terzina here. You shall learn how salt is the taste of another man's bread, and how hard is the way going down and then up another man's stairs, right? We all know the myth of Tuscan bread not having, well, the reality of Tuscan bread not having salt in it. And here this use of Dante in the 13th century talking about the fact that bread that you eat in exile has this salty flavor, whereas your Tuscan bread doesn't. And this will be a sorrow to you. Going back to that word tetragonal, it's what we call in the Divine Comedy, or the rhetorical term, it's a hapax. And there's not a lot of hapaxes in the Divine Comedy. It is there's a word that is only used once in the Divine Comedy. And this is the only time he uses it, this word tetragonal. And it's a direct borrowing from Aristotle. It's this foursquare, it's an architectonic metaphor. You are like a building against the buffeting winds of fortune and chance, right? No matter what chance brings you, destiny, chance brings you, you like a building on four angles, or like a cube. Actually, tetragonal is really a cube. So six-sided, but 4 points on each side. You're solidly in place. So I think this use of this word, this particular definition that Dante gives to himself as tetragonal, I think in some way in this passage influences the way that we start to see Dante, and people start to see him as this figure, this monumental figure against Florence, in spite of Florence. And I'll point you to the etymology of monument, the Latin root moneo, which isn't to celebrate, isn't even what we would consider to monumentalize. It's to warn. So Dante posits his life, his virtue, his truth-telling as a poet, as a warning to Florence, and but also not just a warning, but also a moment of accusation against Florence for what it did in exiling him. And that relationship, that kind of antagonistic relationship, that bitterness, plays through the stories of the way that Dante's monumentalized in this town and elsewhere. Sorry, I have a special effects wizard who does my PowerPoints after I throw images on the sky, and then I say, do your magic, and things come out, I don't know. So the first to monumentalize Dante, besides Dante himself, and I think that's an important point that I want to remember, Dante is the one that sets the stage and others follow. But this is what I gave my talk about before, so I won't dwell on this too much, is Boccaccio. And Boccaccio writes one of the first biographies of Dante just 20 years after Dante dies. And he specifies literally that Florence is a bad city for kicking Dante out, and that Florence should monumentalize Dante. And I want to just show you these two passages to give you this kind of this proof. And I put the sepulcher, we all know there's some Santa Croce up there. We're not going to talk about this so much. We can talk about it later. But to show that Boccaccio's call for a monument, a funerary monument to Dante, actually did happen, if only 500 years later. So here's what Boccaccio says about Florence's treatment of Dante. This was the marble statue erected to the eternal memory of Dante's virtue. With these letters was his name inscribed on tablets of gold among those of the fathers of the country. And he means that the conscription letter that exiled Dante. So that's what they wrote. Instead of an honorary monument, they wrote his exile. By such a favorable opinion were thanks returned for his kindness. Who, considering these things, will say that our republic, Florence, is not lame in its foot, right? So the act of exiling Dante is proof of Florence's vice or lack of virtue. And this work is called the Trattatello in Laude di Dante. This is the work that Boccaccio wrote, this biography. Later in the same work, let's see, he talks about what Dante could have become if it weren't for Florence's kicking him out and holding him back. And this begins this process not only of putting Dante up as a victim of Florence's vice, but also of saying, in some way, he's like a saint and sanctifying Dante, which in fact becomes a kind of a theme in the monumentalization of Dante, as we'll see. So I'm cut off here, so I'll look up here. No loving desires, nor tears of grief, nor household cares, nor the tempting glory of public office, nor the miserable exile, nor intolerable poverty had the power to divert Dante ever from his principal intent, his sacred studies. And if, in spite of all these obstacles, which had been mentioned, he, by dint of intellect and perseverance, became as illustrious as we see him to be, what might he have become if he had had as much help, or nothing working against him, or very few hindrances, as many have? Surely I do not know, but if it were proper to say so, I should say that he would have become a god on earth. So this process of vilifying Florence is also parallel to this kind of exaltation, almost beatification of Dante. And this is, again, not Boccaccio's invention, but following on Dante, right? He continues to press on this idea. So now I want to look at these. I picked three that I want to look at today. These images, these representations, public, not always entirely public representations of Dante, and get a sense of what was happening in the context of the creation of these images and how it follows, or more or less so, this pattern. So you'll all recognize this, I'm sure. This is the painting by Domenico di Michelino of Dante, which is hanging in the Duomo in Florence. And a little more show and tell. You can actually walk right up to it now I don't know, have any of you been in the Duomo recently and seen that there's a staircase? So if you have to do a special reservation, but you can now walk up and get this close to this painting and look at it in detail. And I was very thrilled to be a part of the project. So I've written some of the panels for it, and this flyer you get if you do it as well, to help you kind of get a firsthand approach or a very close vision of this. The problem with it is it's so high that you can't really see it in the Duomo. So with the staircase that's built up there that will be here till next March, you can get up close and personal to this. So this was built and commissioned by the Operai del Duomo di Firenze in 1465. So 200 years after Dante's birth, Florence takes its first step in trying to get the bones back and proposes that in the Duomo, 6 important Florentines who are all buried elsewhere are brought. So Curtius, who is a jurist who's in Bologna, Dante in Ravenna, Petrarch in Arqua, Boccaccio in Certaldo, and Zanobi da Strada, who's heard of Zanobi da Strada? Nobody's heard of Zanobi da Strada, but he was actually made poet laureate. He's buried in Pisa. So 5. Let me just check my notes to make sure I didn't forget anybody. So yes, they wanted to bring 5, all those bones back to Florence and make Leonardo Bruni and Giannozzo Manetti proposed making the Duomo a pantheon. So a place to what Santa Croce will become, they proposed this. And the first thing they do is commission this painting. There's already a painting of Dante in the Duomo, by the way, before this. But they commission a new painting by Domenico di Michelino to go in place and be the first step in the creating of the Duomo as a kind of pantheon to Italian, Florentine, not Italian, Florentine poetic excellence. So that painting is the first example we have that we can see today of this process of, or this interest of Florence and Florentine's political institution. Leonardo Bruni was Chancellor of Florence at the time, of trying to bring back Dante's bones to Florence. Now, I want you to look at this as a representation exactly of this idea of Dante tetragono, this 4 square, because the architecture of this painting is quite severe and quite obvious. Dante's in the middle around these 3 other elements, or 4 other elements, include Paradise on top. On our right, let's do it that way, is the city of Florence. But it's not Dante's Florence. It's 1465 Florence. And Dante's holding his book up, looking at Florence. And as my daughter says about Dante, why is he always so mad? Right? He's castigating Florence and he's exiled from Florence. So this idea of him being exiled outside and Florence being to blame is quite often, because it's quite apparent here. Because what's his other hand doing? Pointing at hell. We're saying, Florence, watch out, you're going to hell. Purgatorio is actually quite interesting because it's very well represented, whereas hell is not. Hell, we don't really get there's the banners that perhaps are either Canto 3 or Canto 34. It's unclear. Satan's kind of down there in the bottom. It's not very representative of hell. There's not a lot of sense of the leveling of hell. Purgatorio is quite accurate. We have all the 7 levels. We got the pre-Purgatorio there. There's one glaring problem in Purgatorio there is those of you who know Purgatorio, who should be at the top? Adam and Eve? No, Beatrice. But that wouldn't work. That doesn't make sense. So they kind of changed Dante's text. So they put Adam and Eve at the top in the Garden of Eden. And paradise is kind of represented by the heavens above. But we have Dante kind of mediating between these architectonic elements of the 2 arches, the arches of hell and the arches of Florence, which kind of parallel each other. And he's placed, I would say, tetragonal, solidly right between these architectural elements. And so from here, we have this idea of Dante, the virtuous, against Florence, the city of vice. Now, you can't see, and I should have put I was hoping you'd be able to see, well, you can kind of see it. If you look at the book, he's holding, of course, it's the open to the first page of the Divine Comedy. And you can see that radiating from one side of the book towards Florence are what we would consider to be rays that almost look like those that are on a saint. I'm not an art historian, so there's probably an official word for that I don't have at my hand right now. But so the book is radiating light, sanctity towards the city. So that's also the other side, that Boccaccio tries to sanctify Dante. Here, Domenico Michelino and those who commissioned this are not sanctifying as much Dante, although hanging him in the Duomo across from images of the four evangelists does give him a certain parallel to important sanctified figures. But it's the poem that becomes sanctified, right? This commedia, which Dante calls it, or the commedia. We call it the commedia. We call it the divine comedy, because it becomes not Dante's own words, but words that come later. It becomes itself the object, a sanctified object. And here in this painting, we see that evolution. So this image I want to bring up because it really shows an early moment in this attempt to get Dante's bones back, to bring him back to the city, but still on the terms that Dante set forth, that he's a victim of Florence's exile, and he's bringing this kind of virtue or leading potential to lead virtuously Florence from its evil ways. And again, I'm reminded of the root word for monument, to warn, right? That we're warning. This painting is very much a warning to Florence, and it was intended, I think, as a warning to Florence to follow a more virtuous path. Wow. Okay. Sorry. It's just... The next painting I want to look at is this painting by Bronzino. Now, I said that most of these were public paintings, and this is I had to say most because this was not originally intended to be a publicly seen painting. In fact, it was meant to be in a private academia that was founded or meant to be founded in the early 16th century by Bartolomeo Bettini, Angelo Bronzino. It was going to be a spin-off of the Medicean Platonic Academy by Ficino, that was started by Ficino. And this room, this camera, was commissioned by Bartolomeo Bettini, by Bronzino and Pontormo, and also originally Michelangelo as well. And in fact, Michelangelo did a cartoon drawing, which became the allegory of Cupid, that Pontormo realized for this room. But Bronzino's role was to paint the poets. And by that, they meant the poets Dante. We think it was going to be Dante. We only have Dante. The other ones don't exist that we know of. But Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Guido Cavalcanti, probably, Guido Guinizelli, we think. But we're just going from what Vasari says, because Vasari mentions this room. So this room was dedicated to the idea of divine love and the power of divine love to help us go beyond the human. And so not erotic love, but divine love as a path towards knowledge, sapienza. And they do so by celebrating these Tuscan vernacular poets, who I just mentioned, and their roles in using Tuscan language to bring people to a greater and deeper understanding of amor, love, as a path to knowledge. So it was a kind of, it was based on Platonic thought, based on this Ficinian idea that came out in the Platonic Academy, brought to another level. But one thing that's important to know is that this group of they weren't scholars, this group of wealthy citizens who considered themselves scholars and poets as well, and philosophers and artists, were anti-Medician. And this was a period when the Medici was restored, and they were in conflict with the Medici, and in fact, had been exiled. So the theme in this painting is divine love, but there's a sub-theme of exile, which comes back to this story that Dante tells of himself, and it continues to get told. And how that story of exile comes into this painting is because this book is not open like any other book is normally open to the first page of a work. All the evangelists are holding the scriptures open to the first page of their gospels. That's the normal iconography. How do we say it in English? Iconography, thank you. Here, this is open to the 25th canto of Paradiso, which goes like this. Should it ever come to pass that the sacred poem to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so that it has made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty that locks me out of the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, foe to the wolves at war with it. That's supposed to be foe, not for. With another voice then, with another fleece, shall I return, a poet, and at the font where I was baptized, take the laurel crown. Exile. So in Canto 25 of Paradiso, where Dante is quizzed on the virtue of hope, he begins the canto by expressing his most important hope, to return to Florence. Not as a politician. He was exiled as a politician. He understands that that's done and gone. But he intends to return to Florence as a poet and as a poet laureate, which never happened while he lived. But find me a statue of Dante in town that doesn't have a laurel crown. Once again, Dante's making his own future and overcoming his own exile, and these paintings that are commissioned in Florence, this, like I said, not a public painting, but a private painting, fulfill that. Florence, again, is the villain. It's exiling Dante. It's also exiling this group of people. So Dante becomes not just a figure of poetic excellence, poetic virtue, but he's the figure of political violence, or of the victim of political violence or political exile. But he overcomes it as a poet laureate. Again, more advertising. I don't know if you saw this, but this painting was on display at the Certosa of Galuzzo, and then at the Palazzo Vecchio, and now it's at the Met. And this volume, which is put together by Antonio Natali, who was the previous director of the Uffizi, and he let me, I contributed a piece to it, is a really nice book. It talks a lot about the history of this painting and this context that I brought up here. So I'm stealing a little bit from myself, but from this, I'm not trying to get you to buy the book, but I'm just showing that how much is going on in Florence about these kinds of discussions. And we're learning more and more about the history of these projects that were throughout the ages to monumentalize Dante. Okay, we're going to jump ahead a little bit further now in time to this statue. So this is the one that I borrowed from my previous talk. This is the statue that's on the cover of the book I wrote on Dante as well. So you recognize this statue? Uffizi, excellent. So this is the statue that's of Dante in the Loggiato dei Uffizi. And it's one of, I don't know off the top of my head how many statues there are, but there are probably at least 40 statues of famous Tuscans. And guess what? This was the first one. So the first statue dedicated in 1839 and realized a few years later, as this project was a public-private project. It was initially a private project, but then the Grand Dukes took over, but then they were kind of in political trouble, so went back to a private project. But they actually got it done, as we see. The first statue that was dedicated to Dante. And this period, as we all know, the early 19th century is the beginning of the Risorgimento. So this was all tied up with the nationhood, with Italian nationhood. And these famous Tuscans and the Grand Dukes in that time were trying to mitigate between this kind of Republican groundswell in Italy and turning into military, and their own positions as Grand Dukes of the land. And so focusing the excellence of Tuscans versus the excellence of Italians was a way of trying to mitigate the effects of the Risorgimento in Florence. But I think it's interesting that we go back to this kind of continually representing Dante in this severe way. This is the one that my daughter says, why is Dante always so mad, right? So Dante's looking at us in judgment and looking at us with a scowl on his face, and he's looking down his nose at us. very much so. Probably one of the statues that we see most of next to Santa Croce, which we'll get to. But I also want to point out this very interesting fact that brings us back to Boccaccio as well, my guy, who is fundamental in kind of promoting this image of Dante. Because I did this last time I was here, but maybe I have a completely different crowd. What's wrong with the statue? What's the big glaring error? I'll drink some water while you think. Yeah, I mean, they're this is a neoclassical garb. I mean, it's a poetic toga. It's a toga of the poet. He's got the laurel crown. More fundamental error. Doesn't have a book, but he's got the lyre, the poet's lyre, right? Keep your down by his feet. His name's spelled wrong. Yeah, 2 L's. Wasn't a mistake though. At least I didn't think so. So I dug through some archives and I went back to why they, I was looking at the dedication process to this and I came across this act. The administrative council, this council that was set up by the Grand Duke to do this project, preferred to restore to its original integrity the name of the most illustrious Tuscan, Dante. And it wanted therefore that Alighieri was to be read in stone, 2 L's. And that we see Boccaccio in the Vita di Dante, the Trattatello, constantly use the double L. It is to be hoped that those who come after will offer here at least this credit to have contributed worthily in the reintegration of that great man with his family name. So on the authority of no one as less important as Boccaccio, who apparently always spelled Dante's last name with 2 L's, they made this great discovery and gave Dante back his original name. No, Boccaccio never spelled Dante's last name with 2 L's. They were working off manuscripts that were 2nd, 3rd generation manuscripts, and all the manuscripts that we have of Dante, of Boccaccio in his own hand, he always spells Dante's name with 1 L. So we continue to insult Dante as we monumentalize him. The greatest insult. This is what I've discovered only in these last year or so. So Dante's my passion. So most of my research and publication has to do with Boccaccio, but you can't talk about Boccaccio without talking about Dante. So I work on that a little bit, but I love teaching Dante, and I don't want to spend too much of my time writing academic articles about Dante because those academics in the room know that that often kills any joy that you might have for the subject you're treating, especially when there's been 700 years of academic writing about the figure you're writing about. So, but still my wife persists by trying to buy me books about Dante, and she usually fails miserably because the last thing I want to read is other people's academic writing about Dante. But she really hit a gold mine this year when she bought me this book. I don't know if you can see it. It's called the Libro Bianco per un Monumento di Dante, because it's a little self-published pamphlet that came out in the late 1960s by a committee that were super pissed off when they moved the statue of Dante in Santa Croce. So this is how I want to conclude my talk today about talking about the greatest insult to Dante, which is what happened to the statue of Dante in Santa Croce. And I call it Dante Posteggiatore because in this book are collected a bunch of reprints of articles in that wonderfully important journalistic bastion of journalistic integrity known as La Nazione. And there was a headline in La Nazione in you guessed it, 65, that said, Dante Posteggiatore, Dante parking lot attendant. Because in about 3 years earlier, they cut down all the trees around Santa Croce, the piazza, and allowed cars to start parking in the middle of Santa Croce. And so apparently it looked like, to at least a fine journalist running the Nazione, hopefully not one is here today, or I'll be lambasted tomorrow in the media, Dante looked like a parking lot attendant and should be moved. So La Nazione picked this up. Political officials picked it up. Now, it couldn't have just been because of the fact that he was blocking an extra parking space in Santa Croce. In fact, it wasn't. Because they wanted to do something new with that piazza besides making a parking lot. They wanted to copy Siena and make this fantastic event where thousands of people would gather to see a historical reenaction of a sporting event. Calcio storico. You can't do calcio storico with a big statue of Dante in the middle of the piazza. So the association worked its political magic in Florence and got the mayor Bargellini to agree to move the statue of Dante somewhere else so that they could play calcio storico and beat each other's brains out once a year. So sure enough, now the flood happened. So that stopped everything for a year or two. Sure enough, May 28th, 1968, a few years after the, what would it be, the 600th anniversary, 700th anniversary of Dante's birth. But the project started in the 700th year of his birth. They took down the statue of Dante. And for 3 years, it lay in a school garden, Giardino di una scuola pubblica in Rifredi until 1971. And it was repositioned in its current place. So to me, this is perhaps the greatest example of the love-hate relationship with Dante. I would say maybe even at the end of the day, they got it right. I like the position of the statue where it is now. But the back and forth and the kind of process of deciding how to move the statue, the politics involved, which are nothing new, in using Dante as a figure and then tossing him aside when it doesn't fit, continues perhaps to this day. So I've lived long enough to Florence to know that you can't talk about Florence as a single thing, right? We got the Comune, we have the Regione, we have different church associates. Everyone's involved in this. So I've understood that these decisions are much more complex than maybe I did before. But still, come on, we can do better. So that's really the story I want to tell to you today. And there's other monuments around town that I didn't talk about, including the one inside the church of Santa Croce. It's a fantastic thing that you can't really walk around Florence without seeing the name Dante everywhere. My students' favorite bar is, or maybe it's a restaurant, but I don't really see it as a restaurant, a trattoria, is Dante and Beatrice. Apparently there's a restaurant called that has a free, unlimited wine policy. So you learn about Dante's in the way that you approach him. But in this age, in this time that we're all remembering Dante, I think it's good to think back about the way that Dante wants himself to be presented and the way that we see him presented in the city as we go around. With that, I'll stop and be happy to have your comments, questions, your own experiences with Dante, the monuments to Dante in Florence. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to unshare the screen, well, if I can. Can you do that, Sarah? Can you unshare the screen? Oh, here it is. Okay, I got it. Stop share. Right, and then we can let the people come up. Don't know how to do that. We bring the thumbnails up. Oh, here. Yeah. Got. I can't make. Anyhow. So any in the room, if any. Oh, we are there. It's just not on here. Okay, good. So you are all up there. I can't see it on my screen. You're all on the big. So the Zoomers are on the big screen in the room, and the people in the room can see the Zoomers. And so we'll do our usual thing. If there's anyone in the room who would like to make a comment or ask a question, put your hand up. If you're in the Zoom and would like to ask a question, you can do it in two ways. You can either put something in the chat, which we'll have a look at, or else you can wave at me and we'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question live. So starting in the room, is there anyone who wants to contribute a question or thought? Yeah, I'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you. So throughout your own sort of personal interest and academic sort of research into Dante, is there anything or any aspects of his life or work that you feel has been sort of previous figures who've chosen to monumentalize him have neglected? And if so, how would you like to see this sort of brought to Florence? Thank you.
Good. Thank you for the question. It's a fantastic question. I think that, you know, we all wish we had magic wands and could do things like that. So I'll talk to you about the way I teach Dante in my classroom briefly in response to that, and because that gives a better idea of what I think that Dante can do to speak to the generations that are reading him for the first time, whether they're 21-year-olds that are in my classroom or 60-year-olds that are reading it. Gets back to what my daughter said today. Oh, why is he always so mad? Dante, in the public imagination, is the poet of Inferno. He's the poet of hell. He's the poet of judgment. He's the poet of damnation, of parole dure, hard, harsh words. I get it. It sells copy. It sells books. But as I age and as I teach Dante over and over again, I continually turn back to Paradiso and reflect on the poet who understands the power of the word to heal and the power of the word to induce people towards love. Sounds hokey, but teaching it and forcing students to read Paradiso, which is not easy, to pull out that theme. That Dante, in the end of the day, is writing a really, really long love poem to this woman named Beatrice. And we lose that because guess where she doesn't appear at all? Well, she's kind of talked about in Canto 2 of Inferno. She's not there. But the insight that Dante has, he has a number, the one that I appreciate the most that Dante has between the Vita Nuova and the Convivio and the Commedia is let her speak. Let Beatrice become a character with a voice who is the one that leads the readers to love. If we could get to that in some way with Dante, I think that would be another version of him that could appeal to people in a different way. And I really like the light show they did of Dante on Ponte Vecchio. I don't know if you were here last Christmas time, I think it was. There was a laser show that they did on Ponte Vecchio of Dante themed. And there was some of that. You know, there was finally the joy of the Divine Comedy, which we don't get when we see the judgmental figure that's monumentalized. Thanks. That's a great question. Thank you.
Jason, there's one on the chat, which is, where is the second portrait that you showed us, the Bronzino? Can one view it? Is it no longer in a private viewing room?
Another word I've learned recently in Italian is wonderful. Ni. Do we know what ni means? No and yes. So it is on public show this year. It was at the Certosa Galluzzo. It was at the Palazzo Vecchio. Now it's at the Met in New York. It will come back to Florence. And Antonio Natale, who knows much more about these things than I do, says it's likely to become available in public because it's privately owned, but the person that owns it wants it to be somewhere. That's all he tells me, and that's all I can tell you. But right now, it's at the Met in New York. But I think in the future, it will be available for public viewing. But
in Florence?
That's the hope. Or maybe not. Maybe Florence doesn't deserve it.
So more questions from the room? Yeah.
So although Florence continues to celebrate Dante with that laser show, for example, last Christmas, why do you think there haven't been attempts, as someone that gets their name misspelled constantly, to correct that misspelling on that monument?
First of all, no one notices it. It's really funny. I mean, let me step back and be an academic for a second. Yucky. To talk about misspellings in 19th century is a little anachronistic. I mean, there's variations that are normal part of textual transmission. So the word misspelling is a kind of maybe not, and I'm playing with that when I use it because it's obvious now. But to the people who made it, it wasn't a misspelling because they were looking at sources. They just weren't looking at the right ones, and they got that wrong. So I'm being a little cruel when I say that. So that, but I guess that's what happens when you carve stuff in stone. I mean, you can't fix it because it becomes, to do anything. I do work with the Certosa fairly closely in their Comitato Scientifico. To move a brick, you got to get the Ministero dei Beni and then you might as well even not try. So it's not as easy as it seems to correct the spelling on a carved statue.
My favorite example of that was about 30 years ago when it was time to restore the paving stones on the Piazza della Signoria because they get worn out by all the visitors. And whilst they were restoring the paving stones, they decided to have a little archaeological dig. And underneath, they found a lot of Roman ruins. And the piazza was closed, I think, for 3 years, whilst the Ministero delle Beati, the Regione, the Comune, the Prefettura, everyone had a debate as to what to do about it. But meanwhile, the Piazza della Signoria was closed for 3 years.
Exactly. Well, as we all know, in Piazza Libertà, they just found some resti under Viale Sparatico Lavagnini. So great. Now the Viale is going to be closed another year.
We have another question on the chat from Mary Jane. She says, coming from a family of dentists, I love the beginning photos from the hawks and the sparrows. Wonderful lecture. So glad the British Institute is back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for that,
yeah.
Mary. Do we know anything more about the dentisti? Dentist?
No, I mean, I could have, if I really wanted to be cattivo, I could have shown the scene from the movie where Ninetto and Toto actually arrive at the convegno, and there's a bunch of stuffy dentisti. And what's particularly hilarious to me is one of the dentisti cites a new work by an American scholar of Dante, which is ridiculous. The title, I forget the title he gives of it, is a ridiculous title. So Italians have been making fun of American dentisti also for as long as we've all been countries. So
you felt well skewered.
Yeah, exactly. My ears were.
So is anyone up on the Zoom would like to unmute themselves and say something? We'd love to hear the voices from around the world. Be brave, be bold. And anyone in the room wants to have another go? Yeah, here we are.
Do you have anything to say about those paintings inside the Chiesa di Dante, near the Casa di Dante?
The Casa di Dante?
I mean, no, the Chiesa, inside the Chiesa, because I know that there are some paintings and, of him there. There's one where Beatrice is getting married and you see him coming out of the church and he's devastated. I love that painting, but I know it's not famous, but
I have never seen them because I can never find that church open.
Oh,
I need to see it. You've convinced me because it talks about the stuff I want them to talk about.
The other one, I think it's a copy of something that's somewhere in the United States of Beatrice surrounded by the Donne dello Schermo. And
Dante Gabriele Rossetti's painting.
It's
yes.
holding his heart. And also, it's not a statue, but I think Marasco gave him the best scenery and put Dante in the end when he wrote the song about the alluvione.
No, I don't know that either.
Oh,
yeah. So I've got more work to do. I've got more work to do.
I'll give you the link.
Things to do. No, so the Dante Gabriele Rossetti painting I think you're referencing is that's a valuable painting, and I think that's one. So I used to teach this class at the University of Oklahoma, Dante, not this, but the Divine Comedy to undergraduates from Oklahoma. So a different kind of. But in the library at the University of Oklahoma was a copy of that painting, right? And so I would, the first day of class, we'd all leave the classroom and I'd say, this is what we're going to be reading about. We're going to be reading about a love story, about an 18-year-old guy who sees this girl for the second time and just doesn't know what to do with himself, right? You know, and spends the rest of his life trying to figure out what to do with himself. But thank you for the other reference. And I do want to say, one thing I want to say about our dentists, more power to everyone who wants to read Dante. There's a lot, I'm trying to have a little bit of fun tonight when talking about these things, but if dentists want to get together and read Dante, great. If doctors want, you know, whoever wants to read Dante, they should get together and read Dante every year is my theory.
That can be our new parlor game, as we can think of different groups to read Dante. So firemen for Dante, you know, whatever. Before we go to a question from Charles, who's waiting to talk, I just want to put in my weekly thanks to everybody around the world on the Zoom who's been making donations to support this program for the last year. We still need those donations. Everyone's free to join on Zoom without any registration fee. But if you felt able to make a donation of whatever size you like, Sarah will put up the link now. It's much appreciated. Having done my commercial, I'll now hand over to Charles.
Thank you so much. Perhaps you can clear up something I've been trying to get straight for a long time now. Boccaccio's lectures on Dante, I see were done in the Badia and in Santo Stefano al Ponte. Do we know where they were done?
The record, okay, I gotta file back a few years. I'm trying to think where in either Boccaccio or it might be a later commentator who was present at the lectures. And if there's someone in the room that has this answer with them, feel free to intervene because it's not fresh on my mind. I can't give you the answer you're looking for off the top of my head. If I was going to bring my book tonight to show, because it's part of what but I didn't, because I thought that would have been too much self publication, but I should have, because in my book I have that answer. But no, but I don't know. Well, sure, but I'll also just send you the answer. It's a first book by an academic for 10 years, so it's not recommended reading for anybody who doesn't have to.
Thanks for that.
Sorry.
Yeah, read the book, Charles. You get information there. Yeah. And anybody on the Zoom like to unmute and say something? You're very quiet this evening. Normally more chatty. Never mind. Anyone more? One more in the room? Yep.
So, having studied such a deeply and rich emotional work in such detail, first of all, what did that make you feel like when you first read it? Because obviously it pushed you to study it in depth. So it must have had quite a profound effect. And also over the years, how has that affected your perception of the world?
I like these questions. These are fantastic. I came to the book because of the cover in high school of the Dorothy Sayers edition, the Penguin edition, and some of you who might have read that. And there was a fantastic hellmouth scene. I was 16, you know, demons eating people and all sorts of nasty punishments going on. And it said comedy on the front. So, geez, it's got violence, it's got humor. Can't go wrong. So I decided that I would make it my thesis project for my senior high school project. Of course, I was disappointed because it's not funny at all. But what I discovered inside was a world that was similar to my own, but different enough to be intriguing. And I think that that's the power of medieval literature, even more than Renaissance stuff. I'll say it as a medievalist. I would much rather look at medieval art than Renaissance art because it's just different enough to be other. But there's enough connection to, at least to my culture, to that I can go along. So I discovered in Dante a world or I found a world that I could discover, and that I knew it would take me a long time to know. And I'm maybe a third of the way there. And so I call my class the world of Dante when I teach it, because I see Dante as an encyclopedic text in the best sense. What does that mean? It means a text that encyclopedia is circular learning. Encyclopedia, the cycle of knowledge, because you can come back to it. The words stay the same, but you change, and it keeps speaking. So it's maybe the one book you can teach your entire life every semester and not get bored teaching it. Or Shakespeare probably counts as well. Milton, perhaps, if you can get over the first couple times you read it, probably also. So that, and not just Western tradition books. There are books from the whole world that are like this, poems, books, that you can continually return to as you change and learn things from. So I had a moment of insight as a 16-year-old, which are very rare, and that was the path I took, and so that's why I continue to teach it like that with my students, is because I think it is something that they can begin with and continue learning from it and come back to it, and I hope we all do.
Thank you very much. So, any more from the Zoom? Any more from the room? No? Yes, we got one more. Brenda.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, you're implying this is so relevant to the present day. Just wondering, do you discuss the current refugee problem in the context of Dante with your students?
I have learned to let the students determine the path of the course. So current refugee, I can't say that exact topic has come up in that context, but certainly topics of otherness and other cultures comes up, especially when teaching Canto 29, where we have the Prophet Muhammad. That's not easy, is it? It's not easy to deal with. I could skip it. There are other places that can be uncomfortable to read. Even Francesca in Canto 5 can be uncomfortable to read. Things are different in the way we're teaching our students now than they were even when I started, which is only 20 years ago, less. So it has to, but I don't bring those out. I let the students bring it out, and I just had my first class yesterday for this group of students, and it was very much, I have goals with this book, but I don't want my goals to get in the way of what you want to do with this book. So your job is to bring out subjects that resonate with you, and so nothing's off limits, and we do. No, often it goes into video games and places that maybe I wish it didn't necessarily always have to go. Game of Thrones and Dante. Maybe that's past now because the kids that's a different generation already. But I encourage those discussions, and I think that's the power of that book, right? Is that of any great book, is that it can continue to generate conversations that are pertinent. They have to. So I don't know that I've talked exactly about the refugee one though, but others for sure.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end. So I think it just remains for me to get back on the camera and thank Jason very much on behalf of all of us for coming in tonight. He's in the middle of a frantically busy time with his students, so I hope we did get a little bit of a downtime by talking about Dante to us. It was, as always, great to hear you and your depth of knowledge. And those in the room can now stay back and we'll have a glass of wine. We'll open up the curtains in the window to make it safe. Sorry the Zoomers can't join us for a glass of wine, but make sure you have one wherever you are, unless you're on the West Coast when it's perhaps still a little bit early for wine. But otherwise, we'll see you all next week. And thanks for coming. And thank you, Jason.
Thank you.